Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken with the Mises Institute, and with me, of course, is Tho Bishop, my associate editor. This is the current events podcast of the Mises Institute, and you can always find more information at mises.org. And before we get going, you may still be able to find a spot for our Human Action Conference coming up in about a week at the Mises Institute at our campus in Auburn, Alabama. So if you are interested, go ahead and it's getting pretty late, but if you'd like to come, go ahead and call the Institute, and we can see if we can find a spot for you there. But it's filling up, but it'll be great if you want to really be in the same room with a lot of our top scholars at the Mises Institute. Lots of senior fellows will be there to discuss the 75th anniversary of human action.
Including Dr. Hoppe, which on a not usual U.S. visit. So
yes, Hans Hoppe will be flying in.
Hoppe meme sign.
So yeah, that's an unusual event. So if you'd like to take advantage of that, make sure and sign up as soon as possible. All right. Well, this week we're going to talk about Joseph Stiglitz. Now, if you're not familiar with Stiglitz, he's been around a long time. He's about 80-something now. But he's one of these old Keynesian warriors from the 70s and 80s. And he's still around, still writing books. The elites still like to pay attention to him. So he's an important guy. And he's got some new books in recent years. One's called The Road to Freedom, which is a play on words of the road to serfdom. He's not a big fan of Hayek. And in recent years, he's really taken to criticizing what so-called neoliberalism. Now, this is a term that's become increasingly used in the last 20 years or so. It's been around for longer than that. And it's had different meanings over time. But you really, from our perspective, from the perspective of someone who likes this podcast, who's sympathetic to the Mises Institute and the free market, laissez-faire liberalism that we support, you need not trouble yourself too much with the details of what people mean by neoliberalism. What it really means to people who use the word as an insult, when they use it as a pejorative, all they really mean is market economy. They mean relatively free markets. They mean what generally we would recognize as capitalism. They mean something other than socialism or highly regulated economies. That's all they mean. So there's no real reason to split hairs a lot in any sort of broader context when we're talking about neoliberalism. When people use the term, people like Stiglitz, when they're generally from the left, center left, when they're using the term, all they mean is there's too much economic freedom. You neoliberals, you people don't believe in enough economic regulation. You don't believe in enough state power. That's all they mean. So that's just code. That's code for you're a neoliberal if you're not socialistic enough. And so he uses this term a lot then to criticize the current system. But here's my main problem with Stiglitz and the way he frames his recent work. And specifically, we're talking about some recent work that he did in terms of really just talking about where the economy is right now and what's wrong with the world. And he put together a very broad article that talks about this. And it's for The Atlantic. It's from last month, and it's called Freedom for the Wolves. And the subtitle is Neoliberal Orthodoxy holds that economic freedom is the basis of every other kind. That orthodox, a Nobel economist says, that is Stiglitz, is not only false, it is devouring itself. So the premise that Stiglitz uses here is that free market economics is the ascendant ideology in the world, that the world is basically run along neoliberal lines, and by neoliberal he means free market capitalism. And the reality, however, is something quite different. So Stiglitz's entire premise is that the world is run by capitalists for capitalists. There's free markets everywhere, and there's barely any role for government regulation anywhere in the world. And so the world in Stiglitz's mind that he's describing is this world where everybody listens to F.A. Hayek and Milton Friedman, and that these are the ascendant influential philosophers and economists in the world right now. And I got bad news for Stiglitz, although I suspect he already knows this. That's not the world we live in. What Stiglitz is really describing when he describes the world is the world where he's on the winning side. The world that Stiglitz is bemoaning as being rife with inequality, as a world where it's hard to make a living, a world where the rich get richer, that's the world Stiglitz has always wanted. This is the world that reflects Stiglitz's view. We live in a world of rampant government regulation. We live in a world where capitalism is something of a joke, where this idea of unregulated free markets is really just a purely theoretical construct now, and it's not something that people live. And I want to be clear also that I'm not making this like no true Scotsman argument. I'm not claiming that no system could be described as capitalist or free market if there's even a 1% tax on, if there's a 1% sales tax, or there's some minor regulations, but everybody keeps 90% of their income, and it's overwhelmingly capitalistic as the system. And I'm not saying, oh, well, you see, there's some tiny fly in the ointment here. It's not real capitalism. I'm not making that stupid socialist claim that until you have total and pure socialism, it's not real socialism. So I'm not even claiming that. I'm just claiming a system that is mostly market economy, that's even mostly free, where it's fairly easy to just start a business and not face 40 or 50% taxation on sales, on capital gains, on income, and all of that stuff that currently burdens people. The reality is we're nowhere even near a system that could be considered free market. And so we have Stiglitz's system. We have the system he wants. And now he's looking around, he's saying, oh, there's all these horrible things going on. It's hard to make a living. The rich are fabulously wealthy as there's all these bailouts going out. And that's all a result of the system he asked for, the system he's been agitating for decades. And we can see that in government revenue, in taxation, in the amount of government employees, the regulatory state. It's all massively larger today than it was 40 years ago. And of course, it's not even the same game or ballpark that it was 100 years ago. So this idea that laissez-faire is it's still there, it's still running the show, that's just simply empirically false. It's just not true. So anytime you see Stiglitz bemoaning the state of the world and the state of the economy and how the poor people suffer, Stiglitz has only himself to thank, because Stiglitz won. Stiglitz and his friends, they created the world we live in today. And that's where we are. Now, Tho, you pointed out this article to me, and you've noted many other blind spots from Stiglitz. So I just wanted to lay down that as kind of the basic premise here that always needs to be kept in mind when we're talking about Stiglitz's critique of the world. But why don't we delve into some of his other crimes, if you will, and really just look at some of the details of what Stiglitz thinks is really going to solve the problem?
Well, it comes to mind, I think, one of the ways that Murray Rothbard introduced a lecture about John Maynard Keynes, how some people might accuse him of engaging in ad hominem. And he rejected that claim because he first destroys the ideas of the person before attacking the individual. I think Stiglitz is a figure that deserves a similar treatment because, baked into this, and, we've talked about this dynamic of the slur of neoliberalism, the absurdity of this, golly gosh darn, these free markets are ruining everything, right? And often we've engaged with it from quote unquote right-wing critiques, right? People that have tried to position themselves as part of this economic nationalists, the Sohrab Amaris in the world, right? We mentioned that a couple of weeks ago in our podcast about Morcano. But it is worth, remembering that there are these figures out there. Stiglitz in particular, he, is kind of, I think, held up as someone who is kind of an interesting sort of heterodox figure that usually criticizes any policy decisions whenever there is moderation after excessive intervention, right? So if you look back, and he criticized the Obama recovery from the Great Recession, right? Was too much, too fast, right? He has this constant sort of role where, whatever the policymakers, whenever they try to take the pedal off the gas, even slightly, that's where he comes in and criticizes them with all the, they're following into, they're acting like Ronald Reagan out there. And of course, now he's taking on this mantle of, attaching it to these, larger left-wing criticisms like, oh, well, look, all these right-wing authoritarians that, are taking over and all that sort of stuff. Of course, what's funny is that Stiglitz, you look at his past history, he was a big cheerleader of Hugo Chavez, right? So like this idea that he's just a golly gosh darn, he just cares about your freedom. I mean, he's been an apologist for any left-wing government. I mean, the most authoritarian, brutal left-wing authoritarian states, so long as they will just roll out the red carpet, providing every sort of handout that he desires as important. And when we look at this book, he has been making the media rounds. This week it was F.A. Hayek's 125th birthday. It's the 80th anniversary of Road to Serfdom. And so one of the products of this book rollout is that Hayek's Google alerts have been going through the charts because Hayek in particular has been made, he highlights him as one of the big boogeyman figures that has created this road to authoritarianism, right? He's the one that has created this freedom for these wolves and the like, right? Which leads to some very interesting people trying to drag on our good friends at Jacobin. Had an article on Hayek's birthday crediting Milton Friedman as being a student of his, which I find very fascinating. It goes into the amount of rigor a lot of these people have to offer. For our listeners, helpful to remember, Milton Friedman was not a student of Hayek. John Maynard Keynes was a pedophile, but Milton Friedman was not a student of F.A. Hayek. And so these things it's part of this larger narrative that has, these books generate a lot of attention. He's been on CNBC. He's been on these because his background, right? He has the perfect resume that you want for someone to throw up all this garbage, right? He's a Nobel Prize winning economist. And isn't that very important? He's been given 40 honorary degrees. He teaches, he's a full professor at Columbia, good old Murray Rothbard's alma mater right there. So he's this perfect sort of figure to place up there. And he's been willing to criticize the Fed. He's been willing to criticize IMF. So he has, just enough anti-establishment talking points that he has presented as this, wise old caretaker, speaking unpopular truths to the policy people today. And what's interesting is you look back and, he talks about, what motivated him to write this latest book, which again, there's nothing particularly original there. It's the same sort of stuff that we've heard going back decades. I mean, he's on the Roosevelt. I think he's the chair of the Roosevelt Institute. This is kind of similar to the, his four freedoms and, the freedom from want being a kind of core focal point of his larger ideological agenda. But what's fascinating is that Stiglitz admits this. I mean, this is his own legend of this book, is that he was motivated in a response to COVID. And him and his poor wife, they felt very trapped in during COVID because all of these authoritarian brutes questioning the scientific rigor of our expert class wouldn't wear masks. And so it dawned on him, just how outrageous it was that people felt that their freedom not to wear a mask was more important than their ability to go out and socialize. And right, of course, the entire, literature there. I mean, even the biggest apologists at the peak of COVID insanity, have admitted that masks played no real role here. He was on CNBC. One of the, he got a little bit of pushback from some of the folks there. One of them was, well, if you're so focused on the government responses to this, to various challenges, don't you undermine the creative process of markets? And his immediate response says, oh, well, we saw back in COVID, right? It was government funding that created all these wonderful vaccines, and one of which being taken off the shelves because of various injuries being reported and documented within Europe and the right. And so, this entire idea, his entire purpose of this book is from this hysterical, stupid response to this moment that plays into all of his pre-existing biases. And that is what so much of this literature is. It is confirmation bias with all of this. And one of the things I think is fascinating is that, whenever these criticisms of neoliberalism, of, these laissez-faire folks, right? If you go and look at what they talk about when it comes to money and inflation, that very quickly identifies who, how serious these people are. his entire views on these things is that the Fed has raised rates way too quickly, that inflation is itself a good thing, that the two he acknowledges a proper point, right? The 2% inflation target is completely made up. It's just pulled out of thin air. He is correct about that, but then he says, "Oh, well, there's nothing wrong with 3%, 4% inflation and the like, because that makes it easier for workers to it's harder for paychecks to go down. The typical sticky wages sort of argument, right? And so this allows for higher wages relative to in other industries, right? So again, someone who is trying to present himself as some sort of great defender of the working class and the freedom of the exploited, right, is effectively embracing the use of these technocratic tools to push people from industries he doesn't like to industries that he does like, industries that he wants to be very heavily funded and subsidized by the government. And so again, once you just scratch just a little bit, you can see the outright authoritarian impulses of people like Stiglitz. And I don't know if there's some sort of, I'd like to believe that there's, some sort of Bill Clinton economic advisor sort of help group, right? You got Robert Reich and you got Joe Stiglitz, and they sit together and they just, they're trying to wash their sins for being associated with that neoliberal regime of the Bill Clinton administration. And so they're spending their waning days, propping up this sort of garbage, right? But, these people are unfortunately taken very seriously within areas of power. And again, their purpose there is to be, the angel or devil, depending on your perspective, on the left-wing shoulder of policymakers, decrying that not enough is being done, that, all these considerations here. And so that's why I think, again, a lot of the arguments made by this group are as old as, these are the same battles that Hayek was taking on. These are the same battles that Mises and Hazlitt and the entire foundation of kind of the modern Austrian movement in response to the Keynesian Revolution and the Great Depression, right? This is the same exact battle, the same exact topics that were going on then, but simply because they are the same battles does not mean that we can assume, does not mean that they should not be punched at, right? These are ideas that have not died off, that are very well represented in places of power, and again, are creating cover for the policy mechanisms. And of course, it also works the other side, is that the people within these policy decisions can kind of make the argument, we're the moderates in the room because we're not going along with what Robert Reich and Joe Stiglitz are doing, right? So it's the entire way of framing this sort of Overton window of economic ideas with all these very well-credentialed, very serious people and Nobel Prize winners on one side. They are allowed to raise their own credibility by taking shots at any attempts at normalization, whatever you want to call it. And then the other side is able to say, okay, well, that is the far extreme. We are the moderates here. And so it's a framing within these larger policy decisions that is worth noticing. And then it's also just fun at laughing at the outright absurdity, because you're not going to laugh, you're going to cry, simply because of the cachet that these voices unfortunately still have within modern popular intellectual discourse.
Yeah, and just to show, if we were to use some metrics to really illustrate how much these people have been getting their way, these moderates. Apparently, moderate policy in terms of the Stiglitz view is to double tax receipts over 40 years. So when Stiglitz thought that the U.S. was returning to total laissez-faire under Reagan, we can look here at what is the combined federal, state, and local tax receipts per capita and inflation adjusted. So it's not going up because the population got larger, and it's certainly not inflation based. This is adjusted for inflation and for the size of the population. In the early 80s, you were looking at under $8,000 per capita. And where is it now? After 2020, we're looking at 14,000. So it's nearly doubled. And I think if we're to really look at the most recent 2023 numbers, you're probably looking at something like 16,000, having totally doubled since that time when supposedly the Reaganites returned to the country to backward total free market economics. We could also look at other measures in terms of federal net outlays per capita. That is the amount of actual spending that's going on. That's, of course, through the roof, going up from about 7,000 up to over 14,000. So again, doubling. And if we look at, say, the Code of Federal Regulations and looking at how many pages we got there, we're going from over that same period, from the 80s to now, from about 90,000 to 180,000 in terms of the pages cranked out for federal. That's just federal regulation. That's not even state stuff. And then, of course, staffing at regulatory agencies has gone up by, nearly 100%. Looking from under 150 up close to 300,000 now. So this is really just quite remarkable how since the 1980s, when Friedman supposedly seized control and there was all that deregulation, you hear about that all the time. And this is so the world that Stiglitz is in, looking at this book and at this article. It's all that stuff you used to hear 20, 30 years ago from people trying to pretend that the New Deal had been completely overturned. Oh, look at all this deregulation that occurred during the 70s and 80s. There was like a couple of things deregulated, like the airlines. That was it. They got rid of the Civil Aeronautics Board. There was a couple other things that were deregulated or quote unquote privatized, which really just meant it was completely unchanged, except that there was this private company that in name was private, but in reality was totally run by some board of governors that were appointed by the governor and was a political institution. So that word's, of course, a misnomer as well, this idea of 1980-style privatization. So none of this was happening. None of this stuff that he claims happened. And just to really emphasize these old nuggets that they're using, I mean, you can go through here and Stiglitz is just trotting out all the usual stuff. It's not even the whole Reagan got rid of the New Deal stuff, which clearly didn't happen. But how about, he's got to bring up Hitler. We got to bring up Hitler and point out that, the reason that Hitler rose is because there wasn't enough of a welfare state in Germany. And so there was too much unemployment. And that's why Hitler rose. Is Stiglitz familiar with what happened in Germany after World War I? He thinks it's all about unemployment. I'm sure it had nothing to do with the French occupation of the Rhineland. It had nothing to do with the total bankruptcy of the German state thanks to the Treaty of Versailles. Sure. Yeah, right. Had nothing to do with the defeat in World War I. Had nothing to do with violent communist gangs driving people to vote for the National Socialists, who were, of course, by the way, Hitler was, his group was called the National Socialists, you remember, because there wasn't much capitalism involved there with the rise of those people. And Stiglitz then, let's see, so we checked off the boxes. Okay, Reagan bad, he hardcore free market guy, Milton Friedman's running the economy, Hitler rose because not enough welfare state. Let's see, what else do we have here? Took some notes here. The soulless position of the free market economists is that, quote, the market is efficient and wise. This is a thing that people like Stiglitz like to create also, is this sort of caricature that free market people are slaves to this concept of a market rather than real people. So they always phrase it in such a way as, these free market people, they believe in the dictates of the market. They believe the market is wise. They believe that the market should run things. Trying to create this idea that there's like this faceless, uncaring institution that is somehow running the economy. The reality, of course, is that free markets, all that means is that individual persons are free to do what they want without being told what to do by some government bureaucrat or someone like Stiglitz. That's all it means. It just means freedom. It means just being free of being locked in a cage or having all of your wealth confiscated by government bureaucrats. But they do it as it's this ideology, it's this market that is running your life, and it really just serves rich people. So that the whole way that it's framed in terms of language is very interesting, and this is something we've been hearing for decades is as well. And then he goes into a bunch of stuff about collective action. This is a very benign way of saying Okay, we need state agents who will fine you, imprison you, arrest you, coerce you unless you follow these regulations. But it's really just collective action. It's people coming together to solve problems. That's what it is. So you can see he uses that here as well. But you can just really, if we could go bit through bit and point out how everything he points out is a problem, such as the rich getting richer. Well, nothing transfers more wealth than the central bank, which Stiglitz loves, and all of this purchasing of commodities, or rather purchasing of assets for the Fed's balance sheet that occurred after 2008, all designed to prop up banks. And this was all the outcome of Stiglitz-style interventionist policy. And of course, all of these efforts to keep the war machine going, which Stiglitz has never had a problem with, and just generally all these massive amounts of regulation, which end up making it difficult for small business people to enter the economy, to create new competitive. I mean, Stiglitz is always talking about competition. There can be no competition without government regulation, when in reality, the regulation that Stiglitz likes is limiting the ability of new firms to enter the economy and to create more competition, because he and his pals raise the cost of starting a business and running a business so high that the only entities that can continue to function in that situation tend to be the larger groups that have access, big corporations, major corporations that have access to lower interest loans and, of course, to bailouts. That once you achieve the level of too big to fail, then you continue to exist in perpetuity. Whereas small businesses, they're all just expected to go belly up and disappear. This is, of course, a huge outcome of the COVID freak out, when we massively subsidized the wealthy, and huge corporations and small businesses were expected to just shut down and go away. And so everything that he lists here as a problem, we could just point out, Stiglitz, you wanted this. This is exactly the outcome that we would expect from your policies. And they just pretend that that's just simply not, that has no role in it. It's committed to this myth of history that they're on the losing side. And I don't know if they actually believe that, or if it's just something that they keep repeating because they know that it benefits their friends in government and, of course, themselves. It makes them look smart and makes them look radical, like they're really upset about the injustice in the world, when they're fine with the status quo. That's what essentially they're defending. And they want just a little bit more regulation, just a little bit more of a little bit more taxes, a little bit more in terms of regulatory power for these government agencies. And that, I think, also illustrates why the real danger that we face right now, it's not from Marxists, it's not from hardcore commie types, it's not people who want to return to some sort of Stalinism or something like that. The real danger is from the interventionists, people like Stiglitz, the third wave people like the Clintons, who it's always just a little bit more regulation, always just a little bit more government power. But of course, as soon as they get just a little bit more, then it's on to the next step, just a little bit more after that. So that after 10 years of cumulative growth, you end up with where we are now. Of course, now we're looking at about 90 years of massive growth since the New Deal. And it's been more and more every single year, piled on top every year. And that's where we are now. And this was all achieved not through communism, not through hardcore socialists taking over. It was all just center, middle of the road, center left, little bit here, little bit there sorts of people. And that's who won. And that is why we are where we are now. And these people are still very much in charge.
Well, again, going back to his views on the Fed's response to COVID, it is worth noting. So kind of his narrative, and this is a narrative that I think reflects a lot of the critics of the Fed from the left, is that basically the Fed's diagnosis that the issue was too low of interest rates, right? Too much money printing, too much done on the spending side in particular, right? He's a big defender. I mean, he would have wanted more fiscal stimulus on that side of the aisle, right? And he points to, if you look back at like personal savings rates during 2020, and they shot up, and this was just a demonstration that it was the uncertainty of the moment, right? That's what really kind of caused a drop in aggregate demand, right? And so the Fed was solving, the Fed's embrace of higher interest rates was a response to something not, it was responding to the wrong indicators there, and that's what set up to the issues that we have right now. But of course, if you look back, not only did the savings rate did go up, it went up to roughly a little over 15%, higher than historical trends there. That part is true. But of course, if you look, it was this very period where the finances, the asset prices of everything else were just going through the roof, right? You had a bubble and everything, with all this money being pumped in. People were day trading and buying meme cryptocurrencies, right? There was this massive, again, it was this period of this massive wealth redistribution and the like, and again, which Stiglitz claims that he doesn't like, but yet advocates for the policies that directly contributed to it. And so again, they did this fascinating job of, again, ultimately what underpins, and it's always which the chicken the egg situation is a valid conversation. Is their economic views lead to the political outcomes, or their economic views, are they rationalized by the desired political outcomes? But ultimately what it comes down to is that, from the perspective of people like Stiglitz, they want the politicalization of everything, which is why they dislike the role that the market plays in consumer sovereignty over political sovereignty in all aspects of life. And so this is why this plays up in the conversations of the Great New Deal, which Stiglitz has said, is the World War III of our generation, which, to be fair, that might have been written a few years ago before we actually have, a hot World War III. I'll give him some grace perhaps there in his metaphor. But this entire dynamic, right, is, this is a major crisis. We need to adjust every aspect of our economy. We need to curtail consumer preference in order to save this much, much larger problem, which is, whatever global crusade that you can use under the name of the climate. And ultimately, this goes down to, I think, really is the core of these criticisms of free markets generally from both the left and the right. It's the question to what should be the ultimate source of power in driving what the future looks like. From our perspective, from the Misesian perspective, we want individual choice in the product of consumer sovereignty, right? Profit and loss should be what dictates how capital is allocated. Individual, entrepreneurship should be what guides the new innovations going forward, right? The regulating system is through successes on the market and the like, right? Consumer preferences, where basically every person with the vote of their dollars is what shapes the future. That is one perspective. Stiglitz's view is that you necessarily need a very powerful, expert-driven state guided by people like himself to identify what are the real problems that the rubes can't understand, that prices can't properly communicate. And so let's provide the proper guidelines so that maybe you can still buy, you're going to have your choice of 4 manufacturers that build the electric stove of your liking, but the gas stove gets phased out, or the electric car, whatever guidelines of what is acceptable within your consumer preference. You have the freedom to decide within that prescribed dynamic there. But the vision, the very enlightened vision of expert rule, creates this dynamic. So it's the political direction going forward, and then motivated by whatever ideology they have. And unfortunately, again, this is where the right-wing critics as well have, is that they want kind of that similar system of preferred guide rails, but guided perhaps by some different ideological viewpoints, right? Instead of having people like Stiglitz identifying what it means to have the good life, it's whatever theocratic theocratic worldview there that might better guide the preferences of, say, a Sarab Amari and the like. But again, it all comes down to this fundamental dynamic of consumer preference versus consumer sovereignty versus political sovereignty. Trust in the mechanism of profit and loss as the mechanism for regulation versus the need for heavy-handed regulation across the board. And of course, the world that we live in obviously has been dictated and dominated by one particular world view here. And so again, these battles that are going on now are the same as they have been for close to 100 years, over 100 years, I suppose, at that point, in this point in the West. But these are very, these are bad people masquerading. And again, when you look at what is it, I think that the one silver lining that we can take from this is that it is easy to get away with levels of taxation, regulation, government control, interventionism in a variety of forms, right? It is easy to get away with that so long as the material well-being that average people feel on the day-to-day basis continues to improve. Now, it's improving less than what it otherwise would, right? But it still continues to improve so they can see, okay, well, tomorrow is more likely to be better than it is yesterday. What we have right now, this is something that in the West has not experienced since the stagflation environment of the 70s we talked about with Peter St. Onge last week. We have not engaged in this dynamic of material discomfort, at least in the United States, right? We have not really experienced something like that. We had a small blip in 2008, but we haven't experienced something like this in quite some time. And the political backlash to this, it's going to represent with some sort of fundamental change within the status quo. And I think this is why you're seeing pedal to the metal. At the same time, we've got a big propaganda campaign going on with MMT. They had a new documentary. They're doing all that group of people are doing their rounds on Jon Stewart, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Jonathan Newman and Bob Murphy and Per Byland are doing great work punching at them on Twitter. But you have the MMT crowd that's trying to utilize this uncertainty to bolster their position. You have Stiglitz, who is not part of that crowd. He has his own criticism there, but is embracing kind of a doubling down of FDR era policies, right? What is old is new again. And so that does create but on the right, on the right, you either have people that are trying to masquerade Stiglitz economic policies with some sort of superficial clinging to Catholic social teaching and the like with some of these crowds, but it creates a massive opportunity for us that have a narrative that demonstrates a radical break from what has been put out there for decades now as white paper policies to get back to this golden era of Reaganism. And that's why I think it requires really going after making the moral case, making the political case, making all of the trying to attack the fallacies of these ideas from every direction possible. Because again, we're in a very unique moment where, again, your average person, the person that has never visited Mises.org, who does not listen to tune into Zero Hedge and check that in the morning, they are caring about the issues that we have been talking about for quite some time now, just because of this material discomfort. The left is trying to, this is why I think people like Stiglitz are trying to get their ideas out here. We have the opportunity right now to provide the alternative view, and one of the points that you'll see in every single crusade of these folks, right? They'll talk about how Reagan era laissez-faire neoliberalism, right, hurt workers, hurt labor, hurt wages, and all that sort of stuff. Of course, our response would be, look at the gold standard, look at the Fed, look at this area, and this is why this battle is so important. This is actually why we're giving away 100,000 copies of What Has Government Done to Our Money. If any of our listeners want to get your copy or get a bundle for groups, you can find that at Mises.org/money. That's MISES.org/money. Get your free copy. But that's why this moment is so important, because, again, the inflation dynamic is something. This is why throughout the history of the West, inflation has been a major political talking point. It has been something that's mobilized, that has taken down governments, that has ushered in massive political change, because it's something that every single person feels on a day-to-day basis, the same way that you don't necessarily feel taxes, that you don't necessarily feel these other dynamics. And again, that dynamic of the workers versus the elite, the wolves versus the sheep in the framing of Stiglitz. We are on the side of the sheep. Stiglitz is the wolf. And so the more that we can, I think, attack from all angles the foundations of this sort of moral argument, this justice argument. The left likes using these terms because they are effective in communicating these ideas, and these are terms, these are foundations, these are battlefields that we should be leaning into, because we have the actual solutions to the claims that they are trying to make. And that's why people like Stiglitz should be attacked, vilified, and demonized. Because again, we've seen what Stiglitz wants, right? Stiglitz wants Chavez-style left-wing totalitarian government. He is on the record as that, and so we should never allow them to try to play in the moral high grounds. Like, oh well, these evil people, they just want authoritarians like Bolsonaro to take over things and create the this dictatorship of capital. And like, no, these are the people that have always been the cheerleaders of some of the most horrific states of the modern world, ranging from the Soviet Union to, unfortunately, the American empire that we have right now.
All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of Radio Rothbard. As Tho mentioned, visit Mises.org, find out more about our giveaway of What Has Government Done to Our Money. This follows on our big giveaway for Economics in One Lesson. And man, everybody wanted that one. And so I definitely would recommend this new Rothbard text as well, which is nice and short. It's an easy read. So check it out. And that's all on mises.org.
And Ryan, it's worth noting that this new version of What Has Government Done to Our Money has some additional commentary by Patrick Newman, Guido Holzman, and Joe Salerno. So even if you already have a copy of this Rothbard classic, this has a little bit more. It brings it up to kind of have some commentary on modern day issues. So even if you already have a copy of What Has Government Done to Our Money, get the new one, because again, what better to add on than some new Newman, Holzman, and Salerno. That's quite an all-star lineup right there, which you can get again at mises.org/money.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We will be back next week with another episode of Radio Rothbard, so we'll see you next time.